A cowboy got the bride nobody wanted. She knew more about horses than any man in the territory. The auction block stood like a splintered throne in the dust of Silver Ridge. Nobody was bidding on the land. They were bidding on the liability attached to it. Jean Fisher sat straight-backed in the sweltering heat, the only woman present not fanning herself, her calloused hands resting on the pommel of her side saddle. She wasn't the property, technically, but whoever bought the Fisher spread got her too. It was the only condition her late, bitter uncle had stipulated. Whispers buzzed through the crowd like horseflies. She was too tall, too silent, and possessed eyes the color of a turning sky before a tornado. But most damning of all, Jean Fisher didn't know her place. She knew horses better than the men who broke them. And in this territory, a woman who didn't fear a wild stallion was a woman to be feared. Stefan Andrushko watched the spectacle from the mercantile awning. A quiet, deliberate man, known for settling scores without drawing his gun. He hadn't come to Silver Ridge for a bride. He needed grazing land to expand his herd, and the prime Fisher spread was going for a song. Auctioneer Haino Frimmy wiped his sweaty brow. 500 acres of prime grass. And Miss Fisher, a capable housekeeper. Yana Overeem, a paunchy local rancher, barked a laugh. Housekeeper. She smells like saddle leather, and told my best hand he was shoeing a horse backward. I ain't paying to have my pride bruised every morning. As murmurs rippled through the crowd, Jean didn't flinch. She stared far beyond the dusty street. Stefan found himself drawn to her strong, capable hands, hands that understood leverage and restraint. $50, Stefan said, his quiet voice cutting through the murmuring. Haino blinked. 50, Mr. Andrushko. The land alone is worth $50, and I take the liability, Stefan interrupted. He locked eyes with Jean. Her gaze met his with the force of a physical blow, holding no gratitude, only fierce, assessing, intelligence. Sold! Haino slammed the gavel down. Stefan walked through the swirling dust and stopped before Jean, noting the exhaustion around her eyes and her stubborn jaw. I didn't buy you, he said quietly. I bought the land. What you do is your business. Jean stood smoothly. My business is the horses, she said, her gritty voice surprisingly melodic. I come with the herd. You bought the land, Mr. Andrushko, but the horses are mine. Aware of the rumors about her gentled mustangs, Stefan nodded. We'll see about that. Riding toward the ranch that evening, the tension crackled. Stefan rode his steady gelding. Jean, a rangy, nervous mare. You ride heavy, Jean remarked, breaking the silence. You sit like you're carrying the weight of the world. It throws his balance off, and he's overcompensating on his right hind. Frowning, Stefan replied, He's sound. For now, she countered. But keep riding him like a sack of grain, and he'll be lame before winter. Prickled by irritation and remembering Overeem's words, Stefan shot back, I've been riding since before you were born. And doing it wrong the whole time, she replied, coolly, riding ahead. They reached the dilapidated ranch house at sunset. The groaning structure starkly contrasted the well-maintained barn, a testament to Jean's priorities. I'll take the couch, Stefan offered, dropping his bags. No need, Jean refused. I sleep in the tack room, closer to the horses. Before he could argue, she vanished into the barn. Standing in the silent valley, Stefan realized he hadn't just bought land. He'd inherited a tempest. As a solitary lantern flared in the barn, he knew the real work wouldn't be breaking the land, but understanding this stubborn woman. Their first week was an exercise in silent friction. Stefan mended fences and inventoried outbuildings, while Jean existed entirely in the barn and lower pastures. They moved in parallel orbits, sharing only brief, flavorless meals. Stefan had yet to see the Fisher herd. Jean rode out before dawn daily, returning inscrutable and smelling of horse sweat. Where are they? Stefan asked, one evening over scorched beans. High Box Canyon, she replied. Better grass, and it keeps them from Overeem's strays. I need to see them. They're grazing on my land. Her eyes narrowed. They're my horses. They aren't accustomed to strangers. I own the grass they're eating. After a tense silence, she nodded sharply. Tomorrow at first light, ride the dun gelding. Your horse is too loud. The next morning, Stefan found the dun saddled, the stirrups perfectly adjusted to his length. They climbed silently into the jagged peaks until the narrow trail opened into a hidden, lush valley. Stefan's breath caught. Instead of ragtag scrub mustangs, a breathtaking herd of sleek, powerful bays, roans, and paints grazed peacefully, moving with synchronized fluidity. Standing guard on a rocky outcropping was a massive, elegant black stallion. He's beautiful, Stefan breathed, instantly calculating the animal's value. His name is Midnight, Jean said softly, riding into the valley. Amazingly, the herd didn't scatter. Jean approached the stallion, and rather than displaying wild aggression, Midnight lowered his head and blew softly into her hand, a greeting between equals. Suddenly, a sharp whistle shattered the peace. 3 men drove scrawny cattle down the opposite slope. Stefan recognized Francisco Hermansen, Jana Overeem's notoriously mean-hired hand. As the mustangs milled nervously, Midnight unleashed a piercing neigh. They're pushing Overeem's sick cattle onto our clean grass, Jean yelled. Francisco laughed cruelly. Just moving some stock, Andrusco. The lethargic, scabby cattle spread out, blocking the Mustang's escape. Stefan drew his rifle. Turn them around, Hermansen. Francisco grinned, hand resting near his sidearm. Or what? You gonna shoot my cows? That's destruction of property. Before Stefan could reply, Jean kicked her mare into a gallop toward the black stallion. Jean, no! Stefan shouted, fearing she'd be trampled. Instead of hurting the Mustangs, she rode alongside Midnight, bearing her hand in his mane and murmuring a rhythmic chant. Midnight reared, unleashing a cry of challenge, and charged the cattle. Moving like a thunderbolt, the stallion scattered the sick cows, using his sheer size to drive them back like a cutting horse. The herd joined the brilliant display of coordination. Within minutes, the cattle fled back up the slope, trapping Francisco in the stampede. Call them off! Francisco screamed. Jean whistled a single note. Instantly, Midnight stopped, snorted, and trotted back to her, the herd following suit. Stefan rode down, sliding his unused rifle away, looking from Overeem's retreating men to the stallion, and finally to Jean. His anger gave way to profound respect. I told you, she said, her gaze daring him to reprimand her. They're my horses. He realized he hadn't just acquired a ranch and a bride. He'd partnered with a force of nature. They're our horses, Stefan corrected firmly but softly, and we'll protect them together. For the first time, the fierce defensive wall behind Jean's eyes lowered just a fraction. Winter locked Silver Ridge in ice, shifting Stefan and Jean's uneasy truce into a quiet rhythm of survival. Working side by side to pitch hay and break ice, the isolated ranch house gradually felt less like a battleground and more like a shared refuge. During a howling blizzard, Stefan found Jean by the hearth, methodically oiling a bridle. You have a soft touch with that leather, he noted. Leather needs care, or it snaps when you need it most. Horses are the same, she replied. Stefan stretched his aching legs toward the fire. Is that why you're hard on people? You think they'll snap? Jean met his gaze. People snap all the time. But if you listen to a horse, they'll tell you what's wrong long before they break. Most men just don't know the language. And you do, he said. My father taught me, she murmured softly. A horse's body is a map of its history. Take your dun gelding. He's favoring his near foreleg because you're riding him heavy on that side, compensating for your own old injury. Stefan froze, bristling. What injury? Jean pointed at his left knee. You favor it when tired. Mount from the offside and shift right in the saddle. The dun is carrying your pain. Stunned, Stefan realized she'd spotted the limp from an old bullet wound he thought he hid well. How could you possibly know? I watch the horses. They reflect their riders. The next morning, Stefan tested the dun gelding's near foreleg. The horse shifted uncomfortably. Jean was right. Ashamed that his unacknowledged pain was hurting his mount, Stefan spent the morning carefully poulticing the leg. When Jean entered, she watched without gloating. It's a subtle strain. Rest and warmth will heal it. Wiping his hands, Stefan looked at her, not as a stubborn burden, but as someone with incredible clarity. Thank you, he said, a momentous concession in the silent barn. Later that week, itinerant farrier Severino Jacot arrived half-frozen, his draft horse dead lame after slipping on ice. The hip is thrown out. I might have to put him down. The distraught man shivered. Jean instantly donned her coat. Show me. In the barn, the trembling horse held its right hind leg awkwardly. It's a dislocation, Severino wept. He'll never pull again. Ignoring him, Jean approached the animal with her soothing rhythmic murmur, feeling its shivering flank. It's not dislocated, she stated sharply. It's a severe nerve pinch from spasming muscle. The slip locked the pelvis. When Severino voiced skepticism, she guided his hand to the horse's spine. The tension originates here. Mesmerized, Stefan asked, What do we do? Release the spasm, Jean said, grabbing a thick rope. Stefan, hold his head. Severino, apply pressure exactly where I say. For a grueling hour, Jean directed them like a surgeon, manipulating the hind leg with the rope while Severino pressed the spinal muscles. The horse groaned in fear, but Stefan held it secure, anchoring Jean's unwavering determination. Now! Jean yelled, hauling the rope with all her leverage. A sickening pop echoed. The horse cried out and nearly collapsed, but Stefan held him. Slowly, the trembling stopped, and the animal gingerly bore weight on its hoof. Severino sobbed in disbelief. Wiping sweat from her forehead, a fiercely satisfied Jean instructed, Stall rest for a month and heat packs twice daily. Stefan walked over and gently brushed a damp lock of hair from her cheek. Surprised by the intimate gesture, Jean didn't pull away. In the dim light, Stefan finally saw her vulnerability. You saved his livelihood, he said softly. I just listened to what the horse was saying, she whispered. As the storm raged outside, they stood together, finally beginning to understand each other's language. The spring thaw brought relentless work and foaling season. Winter had forged a solid working partnership built on mutual respect. Stefan no longer dictated horse management. He watched and quietly supported Jean. Though their relationship wasn't a battleground anymore, it remained a careful dance. They conversed freely, yet Jean still maintained an emotional wall. The calm shattered when a sleek buggy arrived. Stefan, repairing a harness, felt a sinking intuition. The driver, Susan Hussein, the wealthy bank-owning widow of Silver Ridge, looked entirely out of place in her pristine suit. Jean emerged from the barn, her face hardening instantly. Susan offered a tight smile. I've come regarding your uncle's estate, Jean. A specific debt attached to it. The land was sold at auction. Debts were cleared. Jean replied rigidly. Most of them, Susan said, pulling out a document. Your uncle borrowed heavily against the breeding stock. This loan was separate from the mortgage. Jaw tightening, Stefan argued, Hainaut Fremier assured me the auction cleared all encumbrances. Hainaut is an auctioneer, Susan dismissed. The collateral, the horses, are subject to seizure if this isn't settled. Jean paled. They're mine. Legally, they belong to the estate until the $1,500 is paid by month's end, Susan countered coldly. $1,500 was impossible. They had zero cash. Stefan examined the paperwork, realizing Uncle Fisher's reckless secret was legally binding. Until the 30th, Susan warned, climbing into her buggy. Otherwise, the sheriff collects the collateral for the Denver auction. She drove away, leaving a toxic silence. Jean retreated to the barn, leaning heavily against a pregnant mare's stall. "We'll figure this out," Stefan said, touching her shoulder. She pulled away. "There is no we. It's $1,500. I'll sell the lower pasture to Overeem," he offered desperately. "No," Jean blazed. "You won't dismantle your land for my uncle's mistakes. They're our horses," he reminded. "They are my responsibility," she shouted, her suppressed emotions erupting. "Everything my uncle touched turned to rot. I hoped I could save something pure, but he's ruined that too." Slumping against the door, she buried her face in her hands. The formidable wall crumbled, revealing her absolute exhaustion. Stepping close, Stefan wrapped his arms around her. After a stiff moment, she let go, crying silently into his chest. Stefan held her tight, feeling a fierce protective surge far beyond land or livestock. "I won't let her take them," he promised fiercely. The next 2 weeks were frantic. Stefan unsuccessfully scoured neighboring ranches for loans, while Jeanne withdrew into hyper-focused anxiety, practically living in the barn as the impending loss seemed to accelerate foaling season. During a violent spring thunderstorm, Stefan awoke to find Jean missing. Running to the barn, he found her with a distressed bay mare, thrashing in the straw. "She's breech," Jean panted. "The foal is stuck." Stripping his coat, Stefan asked, "What do I do?" "Hold her head, keep her calm, or she'll tear internally." While thunder boomed, Stefan stroked the mare's neck, murmuring softly. Jean worked with desperate focus. After a grueling struggle, Jean gasped, "I have it. When she pushes, help me pull." Synchronized by desperation, they hauled together. With a final heave, the foal slid free. The filly was perfectly formed, but motionless. Jean frantically cleared its airways, rubbing it with straw. "Breathe, please." A heavy silence stretched before a tiny shudder ran through the foal. It gasped, then breathed steadily. The mare nickered, nuzzling her baby. Covered in blood and tears, Jean fell back on her heels. Stefan pulled her close. Sitting exhausted in the dirt, they watched the wobbly filly stand. "She's a fighter," Jean whispered. Watching the fragile life, Stefan realized their fight wasn't just about money. It was about protecting their shared future. "I have an idea," he said, his mind racing. "It's risky, but it might be the only way." Jean looked at him, her eyes filled with absolute trust for the first time. "Tell me." Stefan's plan centered around Esther Bruscantini, an eccentric, immensely wealthy widow from back east who had recently purchased a sprawling estate on the other side of the territory. Rumor had it she was obsessed with carriage driving and was desperately seeking a perfectly matched four-in-hand team of exceptional quality. She had the money to pay an exorbitant price, far exceeding the $1,500 they owed. The catch: they had to prove the horse's worth, and they had to do it quickly. Jean was hesitant. "My horses aren't carriage-trained, Stefan. They're saddle horses. Mustangs. They're smart, and they're responsive," Stefan argued. "We don't need to train them for a parade. We just need to show her their power, their synchronization, and their temperament. We show her the 4 black mares, Midnight's daughters. They move like water together." They had 5 days before Susan Hussein's deadline. They selected the 4 black mares, sleek and powerful, identical in size and stride. The training was intense and often chaotic. Stefan cobbled together a heavy wagon, while Jean worked tirelessly on the ground, teaching the mares to respond to the complex rein cues of a four-in-hand setup. It was a true test of their partnership. Stefan handled the physical modifications of the wagon and the heavier harnessing, while Jean focused entirely on the minds of the horses. She didn't use force. She used the deep bond she had cultivated with them. There were moments of near disaster, tangled traces, panicked balking, but slowly, the mares began to understand. They learned to rely not just on Jean's voice, but on the subtle shifts in the reins handled by Stefan, who proved to have surprisingly soft hands for a man his size. On the 4th day, they received word that Esther Bruscantini was traveling through Silver Ridge on her way to Denver. Stefan intercepted her entourage in town, and with a mixture of charm and sheer desperation, convinced her to detour to the Fisher spread for a demonstration. Esther arrived the next morning, a flamboyant figure in purple silk, peering skeptically through a lorgnette at the muddy yard. Susan Hussein, who had somehow caught wind of the visit, was close behind in her buggy, her face pinched with disapproval. "I assure you, Mrs. Bruscantini," Susan sneered, "these are wild brutes, unsuitable for a lady's carriage." Esther ignored her, turning her sharp gaze on Stefan and Gian. "Show me what you have, Mr. Andrusco. I am not a patient woman." Stefan and Gian led the 4 black mares out. They were harnessed to the heavy, modified wagon. The mares were nervous, snorting and dancing sideways, unused to the cumbersome gear and the audience. Gian stood at their heads, murmuring softly, her presence the only thing keeping them grounded. Stefan climbed onto the wagon box, gathering the complex web of reins. "They look feral," Susan scoffed loudly. "They look powerful," Esther countered, her eyes gleaming with interest. Gian stepped back, nodding to Stefan. "Take them." Stefan released the brake and clicked his tongue. The mares surged forward, their power immense. The wagon jerked, threatening to tip, but Stefan held them steady, applying careful pressure, balancing their forward drive with restraint. They clattered out of the yard and onto the open dirt road leading down the valley. The plan was simple. A fast, controlled run to the old oak tree and back, demonstrating speed, obedience, and synchronization. They started at a brisk trot, the mares moving in perfect unison, their black coats gleaming in the morning sun. It was a breathtaking sight. Even Susan fell silent. "Faster!" Esther demanded, leaning forward in her carriage. Stefan let out a sharp whistle, giving them slightly more rein. The trot shifted seamlessly into a powerful, ground-eating canter. The heavy wagon felt feather-light behind the combined strength of the 4 animals. They moved as one organism, fluid and relentless. They rounded the oak tree smoothly, leaning into the turn with perfect balance. Stefan felt a surge of exhilaration. They were doing it. But as they headed back toward the ranch, disaster struck. From the brush along the side of the road, a massive jackrabbit erupted, bolting directly across the path of the lead mares. The lead right mare panicked, violently swerving to avoid the rabbit. The sudden movement threw the entire team out of rhythm. Traces tangled. The wagon lurched sickeningly, the rear wheels skidding toward the deep ditch that lined the road. Stefan hauled back on the reins, but the combined weight of the panicked horses and the sliding wagon was too much. They were going over. Suddenly, Jean was there. She hadn't stayed in the yard. She had ridden midnight, keeping pace, just out of sight. She didn't try to stop the wagon. Instead, she rode midnight hard, directly alongside the panicked lead mare, placing herself between the team and the ditch. She didn't grab the harness. She simply crowded the mare, using Midnight's massive presence and her own forceful voice to drive the panicked horse back into line. "Hold them, Stefan!" she screamed over the noise of the sliding wheels. Stefan braced his bad leg against the footboard, wrapping the reins around his forearms, and pulled with everything he had, not to stop them, but to straighten them out. For agonizing seconds, the wagon teetered on the edge of the ditch. Then, responding to Jean's pressure on the flank and Stefan's steady pull from behind, the lead mare straightened. The team found its footing, dragging the wagon back onto the solid road. They came to a trembling, snorting halt, right in front of Esther Bruscantini's carriage. Silence descended, broken only by the heavy breathing of the horses and the creak of the leather. Jean sat on Midnight, her chest heaving, her eyes wild but triumphant. Stefan sat on the box, his hands shaking slightly, the leather reins biting into his forearms. Esther Bruscantini slowly lowered her lorgnette. She looked at the panting team, then at Stefan, and finally at Jean. "Magnificent," Esther breathed, her voice filled with genuine awe. "I have never seen such raw power controlled with such intuition." Susan Hussein sputtered. "They nearly killed you. They're dangerous." Esther turned on her, her eyes flashing. "They are alive, Mrs. Hussein, and they were handled brilliantly. A lesser driver would have flipped that wagon. A lesser horsewoman would have let them run." She turned back to Stefan. I will pay $2,000 for the team, Mr. Andrusko, provided the harness is included. Stefan exhaled a breath he felt he'd been holding for a month. He looked at Jean. She nodded, a small, sad smile touching her lips. They were losing 4 beautiful animals, but they were saving the herd and their home. Done, Stefan said. As Esther's men took charge of the team, Susan Hussein slapped her reins angrily, driving her buggy away without another word. The threat was gone. Stefan climbed down from the wagon, his bad leg aching fiercely. He walked over to Jean, who was still mounted on Midnight. You took a hell of a risk, he said, looking up at her. I trust my horses, she replied simply. Then she looked down at him, her gaze softening. And I trust you. It was the first time she had admitted it. The words hung in the air, heavier and more valuable than the gold they had just earned. They had fought the land, the weather, and the greed of others. But the most important victory was the one they had won together. The sale of the 4 mares cleared the debt and left them with enough capital to properly repair the ranch and prepare for the coming winter. The oppressive weight that had hung over the fisher, spread since Stefan's arrival, finally lifted. Yet, a strange melancholy settled over Jeanne. The loss of the 4 mares, Midnight's daughters, clearly ached. She spent even more time with the remaining herd, a silent, solitary figure against the vast landscape. Stefan recognized the shift. He knew that paying the debt hadn't solved the core issue. Jean still felt that the horses were her sole responsibility, a burden she had to carry alone. He needed to show her that the partnership they had forged under duress could exist in peace as well. Autumn arrived, painting the valley in brilliant strokes of gold and crimson. One crisp afternoon, Stefan found Jeanne in the round pen, working with a young, skittish colt. The colt was terrified of the saddle, rearing and striking out every time Jean approached with it. Stefan watched quietly from the fence line. Jean was patient, but the colt's fear was deeply ingrained. He was cornered by wolves as a weanling, Jean explained without turning around, sensing Stefan's presence. He associates the pressure on his back with an attack. You're trying to push through his fear, Stefan observed gently. Jean sighed, lowering the saddle. It's the only way he'll learn it won't hurt him. Maybe he needs to learn he can escape it first, Stefan suggested. Jean frowned, finally turning to face him. If I let him run away from it, he'll never accept it. Stefan climbed over the fence, taking the saddle from her hands. Trust me. He didn't approach the colt. Instead, he placed the saddle on the ground in the center of the pen and walked away, standing next to Jeanne. Now what? She asked, skeptical. Now, we wait. They stood in silence. The colt, trembling in the corner, watched them warily. After several minutes, curiosity overcame fear. The colt took a tentative step toward the saddle, stretching his neck to sniff it. He snorted, backing away quickly. Stefan didn't move. The colt approached again, this time nudging the leather with his nose. He realized it wasn't a predator. It was just an object. He needs to approach it on his terms, Stefan said softly. You can't force trust, Jean. Not from a horse, and not from a person. You have to leave the door open and let them choose to walk through. Jean looked at him, the meaning of his words hitting her with the force of a physical blow. He wasn't just talking about the colt. He was talking about her. He was talking about the walls she had built, the stubborn independence she wore as a shield. He had bought her at auction, forced into a situation she hadn't chosen. But since that day, he had never forced her hand. He had fought beside her, supported her, and learned from her. He had offered her a partnership, and she had kept him at arm's length, terrified that relying on someone else meant losing control. She watched the colt cautiously paw at the saddle, the panic leaving his eyes. Jean started, her voice catching. She looked away, staring hard at the distant mountains. I've never relied on anyone. My father died when I was young. My uncle viewed me as a farmhand. The horses, they were the only things that never disappointed me. Stefan reached out, gently taking her hand. His fingers were rough, calloused from hard work, but his touch was incredibly gentle. "I'm not your uncle, Jean," he said quietly. "And I'm not trying to take your horses away. I want to build this place with you. But I can't do it if you keep fighting me." Jean looked down at their joined hands. For the first time in her life, she felt a desire to let go, to share the weight she had carried for so long. She looked up into Stefan's eyes, seeing the quiet strength and unwavering patience that had weathered every storm she had thrown at him. "You ride heavy," she whispered, a faint, genuine smile touching her lips. Stefan smiled back, the tension leaving his shoulders. "I know, but I'm learning." He squeezed her hand, then let go. He walked slowly toward the center of the pen. He didn't pick up the saddle. Instead, he held his hand out toward the colt. The colt watched him, then slowly, deliberately, walked over and pressed his nose into Stefan's palm. Jean watched them, the tight knot in her chest finally unraveling. The survival instinct that had kept her isolated for so long was slowly being replaced by something entirely new: hope. Later that evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sun sink below the horizon, the silence between them was no longer heavy with unspoken conflict, but comfortable and warm. "Petter Hubbard from the Bar K rode by today," Stefan mentioned casually, whittling a piece of pine. "He's looking for a gentled saddle horse for his daughter, willing to pay top dollar." Jean considered this. "The bay gelding in the lower pasture is ready. He's steady, good mind." "I'll tell him to come look," Stefan agreed. He paused, blowing the shavings off the wood. "I was thinking, maybe we shouldn't just sell the finished horses. Maybe we could start a breeding program, focused on temperament and endurance. Your Mustangs crossed with some solid quarter-horse blood." Jean turned to him, her eyes wide. This wasn't just about selling off assets. This was about building a legacy. It was a vision of a future she hadn't dared to dream of. "It would take time," she said slowly, her mind already racing with possibilities. "And a lot of work." "We have time," Stefan said, meeting her gaze. "And we know how to work." Jean looked out over the valley, bathed in the fading golden light. The land was harsh, unforgiving, but it was theirs. And for the first time, she realized that the man sitting beside her wasn't a liability or a captor. He was the partner she hadn't known she needed. "Okay," she said, the word barely more than a breath. "Let's do it." It wasn't a grand declaration of love, but in the quiet pragmatism of Silver Ridge, it was something far more profound. It was an agreement to share the reins, to trust the journey, and to build a life together from the dust and bone of a broken past. The cowboy had indeed gotten the bride nobody wanted, but he had discovered what everyone else had missed: the untamed heart of a woman who knew that true strength lay not in dominance, but in understanding. If you enjoyed the rugged journey of Jean and Stefan, and how their shared understanding of untamed spirits forged an unbreakable bond, please hit the like button. This story proves that the greatest partnerships often arise from the most unexpected circumstances. If you want more cinematic, emotionally driven Western tales with strong characters and unexpected twists, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Don't forget to share this story with friends who appreciate a slow burn romance and a deep connection to the land and its creatures. Let me know in the comments which scene resonated with you the most.